Hello, task force members and members of the public. It is now 1:01. I will call on Parliamentarian Johnson, who will then call for Ms. Belton so that we can establish a quorum to proceed with the rest of the hearing today. Thank you. Parliamentarian Johnson.
Yes, can you, oh, you couldn't hear me, I'm sorry. I was just saying, I wanted to make sure you received the notice regarding the first witness, that he would not be able to testify until 1:40.
Oh, no, I didn't receive that, but.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. I just received the text. Yes, Attorney Belton, can you please call the roll to establish a quorum?
Thank you, Chair Moore and Parliamentarian Johnson. We will now go down the list that the task force members indicate their presence. Chair Moore?
Present.
Vice Chair Dr. Brown?
Present.
Senator Stephen Bradford? Senator Stephen Bradford? Dr. Cheryl Grills?
Present.
Lisa Holder?
Present.
Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer?
Present.
Dr. Javon Scott Lewis?
Present.
Don Tamaki?
Present.
Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp?
Here.
Madam Chair, there are 9 members of the task force and 5 members are needed for quorum. There are 8 members of the task force currently present. A quorum has been reestablished.
Thank you very much, Ms. Belton. Really quickly before we get into our next panel, Parliamentarian Johnson, I have yet to receive an email or text message. Can you clarify which witness referencing?
Yes, of course. I just received a message that the witness at 1 o'clock, Mr. Dean, that's Terence Dean, is unable to testify until 1:40.
Okay.
And
Thank you for that. Thank you. So without further ado, we'll reorder the schedule of our panelists and we will move Terence Dean towards the end of the panel. So I would like to take this moment to remind each witness panel that their testimony is recorded, live streamed, and will be available to the public. And this panel on the racial wealth gap will run from 1 o'clock to 2:20. So the first expert witness we will hear from today regarding the racial wealth gap is Professor Thomas Kramer, who will have 15 minutes to speak. Dr. Thomas Kramer is an associate professor in the Department of Public Policy at the University of Connecticut. He has conducted numerous studies on the psychology of race and has written numerous papers on reparations for slavery. Then we will hear from Kavon Ward. Kavon Ward is the founder of Justice for Bruce Beach and the co-founder of Where Is My Land? Kavon is a PhD student at Antioch University and an award-winning spoken word artist. Then we will hear from Paul Austin. Paul Austin is a resident of Marin City and the founder and CEO of Play Marin, a nonprofit dedicated to providing adequate access to extracurricular and athletic opportunity in Marin City. Then we will hear from Dr. Terence Dean. Terence Dean is a professor of Black Studies at Denison University in Ohio. Mr. Dean was formerly an MTV executive and is the author of numerous books. Professor Dean will speak on the town of Allensworth, which was the first town in California that was completely controlled and financed by Black Americans. And then Paul Austin will speak to his personal experience with his and his wife, Tanisha Austin, and the discrimination they faced in the home appraisal system. Without further ado, I would like to extend the microphone to Thomas Kramer. Professor Kramer, you may begin your expert testimony when you are available. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the task force for their inspiring work and for allowing me to testify. I prepared a little slide presentation titled "The Wealth Gap and Lost Wages Due to Slavery." Is that slideshow available? Okay, can you see it on the screen? Yes.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. If you could put on the next slide, please. Please forward the slide. Okay. This is what I will be speaking about, and I will address my personal motivation for the research at the end. Next slide, please. I will first introduce myself. Next slide. My name is Thomas Kramer. I'm an associate professor at the University of Connecticut's Department of Public Policy. I obtained a political science doctorate in 2001 from the University of Tübingen in my native Germany, and a PhD from Stony Brook University, New York in 2005. My research focuses on implicit and explicit racial attitudes in the United States and how they influence people's opinions on race-related policies, including slavery reparations. Next slide, please. I was asked to testify about the black-white wealth gap and its likely origin in the historical injustices of slavery and post-slavery de jure anti-black racial discrimination. Next slide. William Darity and Kirsten Mullen in their book From Here to Equality write, next slide, we view the racial wealth gap as the most robust indicator of the cumulative economic effects of white supremacy in the United States. So that includes slavery and post-slavery discrimination. Next slide, please. I use average household net worth figures provided by Buta et al. For the year 2019 to compute the per capita black-white wealth gap. I will explain in a moment why I use average rather than median net worth figures. The gap in average household wealth in 2019 amounted to $840,900. Next slide, please. Then I divided each group's average household wealth figure by the average household size in 2019 based on US Census figures. Next slide, please. And arrived at an average per capita wealth gap of $358,293. Next slide. In other words, if the goal of reparations to African American descendants of the enslaved in the US is the elimination of the wealth gap, net reparations would have to amount to at least $358,293 per eligible recipient. I cannot know ahead of time how many people will be eligible, and eligibility criteria may be in flux for a while. So I'm using readily available numbers from the US Census to estimate the number of African American descendants of the enslaved in the US. I take the number of non-Hispanic Blacks or African Americans in the US Bureau of the Census's count, which in 2019 amounted to approximately 41 million individuals. This will inevitably include some Black people without enslaved ancestors in the US, but it may miss some otherwise eligible individuals as well. So this is a very rough estimate. With this estimate, an amount of roughly $14.7 trillion would be sufficient to close the average per capita black-white wealth gap in one fell swoop. Next slide, please. While this is technically possible, it would be very difficult for an individual state like California to provide that kind of reparations. For example, if California were to pay the roughly estimated 2 million Black non-Hispanic descendants of the enslaved in the US, again, a rough estimate of eligible recipients that lived in the state in 2019, that amount in reparations, it would spend $778.6 billion in 2019 dollars. However, the state's budget in 2019 was only, and I use only in quotation marks, $215 billion, nowhere near enough to cover the expenses. Instead, California could exert pressure on the federal government to provide federal-level reparations. After all, it was the federal government that allowed slavery to exist in the United States. Thus, it would be proper for the federal government to provide reparations. Next slide. So why not take the lower median per capita wealth gap, which could be closed with a reparations budget of only, and again, only in quotation marks, $2.87 trillion in 2019 dollars. The median is a statistical procedure to produce the typical amount of wealth in a population unaffected by some very rich outliers. Given that slave owners tended to be rich outliers among whites, and by extension their heirs today, we would miss all of these estates if we went by the statistical procedure of the median. The mean better represents the entire contribution, rich as well as poor, in each group. Next slide. Another reason that I would opt for the larger average wealth gap as a basis for reparations rather than the smaller median wealth gap is that losses in wages to African American enslaved alone can account for the current average per capita wealth gap based on a rough back of the envelope calculation. The calculation only considers withheld wages during the period of slavery in the United States, not colonial slavery. And it does not consider post-slavery anti-Black racial discrimination, not because this is not important, but because further research would be required. Next slide. What is required for the back of the envelope calculation is an estimate of the enslaved population in each year from 1776 to 1860. Numbers for the Civil War years are too unreliable to estimate. To keep my calculation conservative, I'm therefore ignoring them. Next slide, please. The US Bureau of the Census provides counts of the enslaved population in each decade from 1790 to 1860. To estimate the enslaved population between decennial censuses, I use linear interpolation, and for the years before 1790, linear extrapolation. More sophisticated methods can be used, but I'm going with the simplest one, and the results are not that different. Next slide, please. Then I turn to Officer and Williamson's historical records of unskilled hourly wages in nominal dollars in the years 1790 to 1860. Which again are very conservative, as many of the enslaved were in fact skilled. In fact, they were often selected for their skills. I use an estimation procedure for the years before 1790. I should mention that the hourly wages are incredibly small. In 1790, the average hourly wage for an unskilled laborer amounted to 2 cents, and by 1860, it had risen to 8 cents per hour. This is another feature that makes my back of the envelope calculation extremely conservative. Now I turn to the question how many hours the enslaved lost through enslavement. Enslavement for life, and it was heritable from generation to generation. This meant that the enslaved had no control over how to spend their time in the free labor market sense. They lost control over all 24 hours of the day. Slave owners benefited from this enslaved only during the time the enslaved were performing field work for cash crop production, because that yielded products that could be exchanged for money on a market. However, the enslaved produced many services that were not exchanged for money on a market, from draining the fields, building and maintaining plantations, to producing clothing, cooking food, raising their own and the slave owners' children, and so on. That work often lasted into the night. Sleep was granted by the slave owner based on his or her own self-interest considerations, not the interests of the enslaved. The question, therefore, is, what would a slave owner have had to pay free laborers on the labor market to be on call for 24 hours a day, 365 days a year? Economists like to deduct from this amount time for sleep as well as the cost for food and shelter. But based on basic assumptions of market economics, this is, in my view, wrong-headed. It would only make sense if the enslaved had been part of the negotiations, but they were not. The price of an enslaved person was negotiated between two slave owners, never including the voice of the enslaved. Food and shelter remained the property of the slave owner, even when it was consumed by the enslaved. Next slide, please. Did I miss a slide? If you could go further. I think I missed one instruction. If you could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, this is an excerpt from my Excel spreadsheet, which is cut off in 1794, but continues to 1860 and compounds the amount up to the present time. So the next step in my computation is to take the number of enslaved in the United States in each year times 24 hours a day times 365 days a year times the puny historical hourly wage and add a moderate interest rate to the total to reflect non-payment. In my example, I'm using only 3% interest, which is unlikely to be enough to make up for inflation. It's a very conservative amount. More realistic would be 6%, the amount of interest specified, for example, in the sales contract of Georgetown University when it sold 272 enslaved in 1838 to save the institution from financial ruin. Next slide, please. But I'm going with a much more conservative interest rate of 3%. With that, I arrive at a 2019 estimate of $19.14 trillion. Next slide, please. I should mention that merely doubling the interest rate to the more realistic 6% would exponentially blow up the total estimates to $6.6 quadrillion 2019 dollars. Next slide, please. Thus, the interest rate will be the most important figure to negotiate between the descendant community and the federal government should such negotiations begin in earnest. Next slide. So let me stick with a 3% compound interest estimate of $19.14 trillion. Next slide. Now, the average amount of reparations owed per US resident can be estimated by using the US Bureau of the Census's count of the 2019 US population, which included approximately 328 million individuals. This includes everyone who at least indirectly benefits from the startup capital that slavery provided to the US economy today. It includes first-generation immigrants like myself, as well as African-American descendants of the enslaved, as well as everybody else. Each US resident would owe on average $58,302. African-American descendants of the enslaved in the US would receive reparations in a larger amount, and the net amount, if you subtract that $58,000, would be $406,785 per eligible recipient in 2019 dollars. This means that wage-based reparations at only 3% interest would comfortably close the 2019 average per capita black-white wealth gap of $358,293. Next slide. Of course, this only addresses losses due to withheld wages during US slavery and thus lost inheritances. What is missing is colonial slavery as well as post-slavery de jure anti-Black racial discrimination. And missing, according to Professor Swinton's proposed comprehensive formulas, are lost freedom during colonial and US slavery, as well as lost opportunities to acquire capital, as well as pain and suffering during all these time periods. Next slide. Thus, in conclusion, the average per capita, next slide, sorry. The average per capita black-white wealth gap should be considered a minimum amount of reparations to restore a status of fairness. Next slide. Slavery produced the startup capital for the rise of the US economy at the exclusive expense of the African Americans who were enslaved. Their descendants deserve recognition of this fact through a comprehensive federal reparations program. Next slide. Whatever California can do to support the call for federal reparations to the African American descendants of the enslaved in the US will be an exercise in the restoration of justice. Next slide, please. I will close my statement with a personal motivation for my research. Next slide. My interest in the question of race, racism, and reconciliation is based on my experience of growing up in Germany. Next slide. And learning about the Holocaust in every high school subject, I felt ashamed of our German history and always dreamed of being able to express to a Holocaust survivor how I felt. Of course, I never thought I would have the chance. Next slide. One day, though, I met Mieczysław Langer, a survivor of 5 concentration camps and a death march in his youth. He and his wife had just retired from Israel to my hometown of Tübingen, Germany, of all places. Next slide. I was amazed at how this man, who had suffered so much at German hands, was able to trust in younger Germans like myself and in Germany as a country after all that he had suffered in his youth. Next slide. I learned later that he had received a reparations pension of about $2,000 a month from the 1970s all the way to 2015, when he unfortunately passed away. Over a period of roughly 45 years, this would amount to a little over $1 million. An amount, of course, that is merely symbolic, as it could not possibly compensate for all that Mieczysław had suffered. He lost his entire larger family and barely survived himself. Next slide, please. The purpose of the reparations pension was to serve as a material token of sincerity, giving way to German promises to never let it happen again. And I think this is all that reparations can be. A symbolic gesture giving weight and credibility to words of apology for historical injustices. Next slide. And with that, I say thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kramer, for that informative expert testimony and for also invoking some of your personal story at the end of your presentation. Thank you for that. And now I would like to turn it to Kavon Ward. Kavon Ward, you have 20 minutes and you may begin your testimony when you are ready. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Kavon Ward, and I am founder of Justice for Bruce's Beach and co-founder of Where's My Land. I'm also an activist and a poet. Justice for Bruce's Beach is a grassroots organization, and it was created to obtain land restoration and restitution for the Bruce family. Justice for Bruce's Beach gave birth to Where Is My Land, a national organization founded by myself and Ashanti Martin to help Black families reclaim stolen land through advocacy, research, and technology. Bruce's Beach has set a precedent, as it is the first time in U.S. history that land stolen from Black Americans has been returned. Since Governor Newsom signed SB 796, a bill introduced by Senator Bradford to allow for the transfer of the land from Los Angeles County to the Bruce family descendants, Whereas My Land has had an influx of families from around the nation asking us to aid them in their endeavors to get back stolen land from their ancestors, land stolen from their ancestors. While I am grateful the land is being returned to the Bruce family, the city of Manhattan Beach still has a debt to pay to the Bruces. The city of Manhattan Beach owes the Bruce family restitution for violating their civil and human rights and for stripping them of the opportunity to pass down generational wealth. Perhaps one way for this task force to consider closing the wealth gap is by supporting and providing resources to organizations like Where's My Land and an effort to aid other Black families in California, such as the Preludes, in reclaiming their stolen land. I could sit here and define reparations and regurgitate facts about how marginalized Black people are and how Black land theft has contributed immensely to the loss of generational wealth and the wealth gap between whites and Black people. And I can sit here and rebut arguments made by white people around why they shouldn't pay for the sins of their ancestors. But I won't, because we've heard speaker after speaker do that. They've already made solid and compelling arguments for reparations. But what I will urge you members of the task force to consider is the possibility of tiering reparations so that everyone of the African diaspora in California gets them, not just descendants of Africans who were enslaved and brought here. I ask for this consideration because all Black people in America are impacted by white supremacy and deal with everyday racism and racial battle fatigue. When LAPD pulls over a Black person, they don't treat Haitians or Jamaicans any less harshly than they treat African Americans. When I was asked to testify before this task force, I was asked to talk about why I believe reparations are important, who I propose reparations be paid to, and what I think reparations should be paid for. The best way for me as a poet to answer the what question is through poetry. So I'd like to close with this reparations piece I created. As Ta-Nehisi Coates said, America begins in Black plunder and white democracy. Two features that are not contradictory, but complementary. Every whip slash inflicted on their backs ironically gave them strength to carry on their shoulders the burden of trickery, treachery, and conformity. Let's not forget the burden of you dismantling the Black family and using Black babies to breed human machinery. Machinery used to provide centuries of privilege and stability for you and your offsprings. And as I write this piece, my hand chokes pen angrily and the red ink from it bleeds, reminding me of the 1920s, Bruce's Beach and Black Wall Street, reminding me of decade after decade of your people consistently stealing from me. You keep telling me and my people to get over it, but how can we when the consequences still exist and when your grandfather's clock of wealth, it continues to tick? As long as you keep benefiting from my people's timeless misfortunes, you should never fix your expectations for me to forget. I won't get over this. America is in debt. They run up a bill on their Black card, and now it's time for them to pay what's rightfully ours. No more committing identity fraud. And if you refuse to pay me monetarily, at the very least, pay me for the respect your ancestors stole from mine during slavery when you forced her to breastfeed your babies, but refused to nourish her body with the very foods she prepared for you and your family. The balance won't disappear. It'll only accrue more interest until you take serious our interest and make payments. Pay us reparations for our separation, separation from our property, our family, our dignity, and our liberty, separation from our mother's land, the motherland during slavery. Pay me because you steadily deprived me of everything I worked hard for and earned. Pay me because your sweet little Becky can get a job, void a college degree, and still be paid more than me, even though I obtained a master's degree. Pay me because you refused to hire me, all because my hair defies gravity. Pay me for discriminating against me because I choose to use a loctician and refuse to conform to the European standards of beauty. Pay me because you use my tax dollars to build prisons for my people and their children instead of schools with updated curricula and teachers that educate effectively. Pay me because you created a school or prison pipeline and you called it a remedy, when in actuality it's modern day slavery. Pay me because I have to prepare my child to expect police brutality and to accept the reality that the cops can kill her and walk away scot-free. Pay me for redlining, white flight, and the red, white, and blue light signaling for me to pull over, all because I'm driving while Black in a white neighborhood at night. Pay us for standing on the front lines overseas to fight your war, only to be assaulted for wearing an American uniform once we step back on US soil. Pay me, and pay me handsomely. My hand will continue to choke pen as red ink from it bleeds, reminding me of Troy Anthony Davis, Marissa Alexander, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Archie Elliott, Oscar Grant, Sandra Bland, Ahmaud Arbery, Christopher DeAndre Mitchell, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. My hand will continue to choke pen and force it to bleed until I am deceased, or until this country has paid me for all they have stolen from me and for the Black keloid scars they've left on humanity. Pay me. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Kavon Ward, for your testimony. We appreciate it. We will now go to Paul Austin. Paul Austin, you may begin your testimony when you are available, when you're ready.
Well, yes, thank you for having me. I'm glad that I was signed on, number one. First, I'd like to say this is a privilege that I have the opportunity to speak in front of you guys to talk about my personal story. I would just like to go back a little bit in history.
Would you like to be seen via video? Just putting that out there that we can't see you via video. Don't know if that was a personal choice or not, but if you want to be seen, make sure you put your video on.
1 second. Can you see me now?
No.
Because the save video is working.
Mm. Hmm. Well,
I would love to be seen, but if not, I perfectly do understand.
well,
How long
yeah,
on
you
this?
can just continue.
Okay, well, I would just.
You can continue, excuse me. Or you can log out and log back in again if you really want to be seen. If not, you can just continue your testimony. And I apologize for any technical difficulties.
No problem. Can I try that real quickly?
Yes.
Logging out.
And someone's going to help you.
Okay,
Someone from staff should be reaching out.
All right, thank you.
You? Just putting that out there. We see you now.
We see. Okay, we're good.
Yes, we're good to go. Thank you very much. And you can begin your testimony when you're ready.
No problem. Well, first, I'd like to say thank you for having me. Thank you. I'm excited to be here, number one. I'm going to start with why I'm here, then I'll go a little bit into history. The reason why I was asked to testify, me and my wife, Tanisha, was because our story about our home went viral. And it went viral because we had an appraiser come out in 2019 to appraise our home. I was at home at the time. She was an older white woman, and she appraised our house for just underneath $1 million. This was after we had put already an additional $400,000 into our property. It wasn't the first appraisal that we got. We had got an appraisal a year before we did an additional 1,300 square feet. And the appraiser appraised our house for just under $1 million. But everything else in our area, we did our homework. We know it should appraise for about 1.4. So we had to fight against it. And we fought. And the next appraiser came out and appraised our house for $500,000 more, 1.4. That's a $500,000 difference, just because we believe the white lady wanted to devalue our property because we are in a Black neighborhood and the home belonged to a Black family. But the second appraiser, we did something different. We asked our good friend, Jan, to come out and act like she was my wife, Tanisha. We took down all of our Black art. We took down pictures of our family. Anything that could have resembled that this home belonged to a young Black couple, we took it down. Jan brought over a picture of her family, and she sat at our island, and she acted as if she was my wife. And yes, the home was appraised for $500,000 more. Appraised for what it should have been appraised for. And yes, we was thankful that happened. Just imagine if we didn't have the will or the strength to fight against the appraisal company. Now, I would like to go back a little bit, and then I'll come back to that again. But my grandparents migrated from the South to work in the shipyards back in the 1940s. They worked in the Sausalito shipyards, which is located in Marin County. They worked in those shipyards, and everybody at that time lived in governmental housing, which was located in Marin City. When the war ended around 1942, World War II ended in 1942, my grandparents had enough money, both sets, my dad and my mother grandparents. They both had enough money and they wanted to relocate if they had the opportunity throughout Marin. But they did not have that opportunity. Due to redlining, Black people wasn't able to buy land outside of Marin City and the rest of Marin. If you look at Marin County currently, it's arguably the richest county in California. But the data shows from race counts that Marin County also has the largest disparities anywhere. Education, economics. There's such a huge gap from what you see white people have and what you see the small percentage of Black people have. And so, yes, I do want to see a change because I don't want to see my children have to deal with this. I do want to see our property value in Marin City to increase because currently it's not looked upon that as if it should increase. So I live in a county where currently our neighbors a mile away, their homes are valued at 1.6, 1.7. Even though it sits on the same lot, the home may even be smaller. We have to question ourselves and ask, why is that? I know for me, I could just look directly at the county in which I live in, which is predominantly white, and look at the small pocket of that is Marin City and how Marin City have been treated constantly, how it's been ignored, how the education system has failed our children, and I mean Black children. The Marin City Sausalito School District got hit with a desegregation law 2 years ago. The first one in over 50 years in California. Because a district that only has 2 schools in it decided to put all the Black and brown kids in one school and then deprive them of what they needed. So yes, the state had to step in and stop that. This is the small city that I live in. And it's not even a city, it's actually not incorporated. There's about 3,000 people in this area, and the land is very valuable. It's 7 minutes away from the Golden Gate Bridge. So we are right now fighting gentrification because the land is so valuable. But then we fast forward back to my story. We wasn't looking to sell our home. We was not looking to do anything with our home but complete the small details and build out that we was looking to do. Our home initially was 1,300 square feet. We then added an additional 1,300 square feet. That's 2,000 square feet. And when this lady came in and looked at our home and she was, oh, I love your view. She talked about everything that we've done with it, added the fireplace, added a room downstairs for us, plus added an ADU, an apartment, 1 bedroom. And then for her to come back and lowball us and give us comps, the comps that she used for our home was so off and so wrong. She used a townhome that was only like 1,100 square feet. She did use a home in a neighboring area, but the home was small, it was ran down. She called Marin City a distinct marketable area. I took that as code word, as it's a Black area. We have a beautiful water view of the bay. She deemed us for having a view or our house being on a hill. Something that I've never heard before when talking to other people in this business. But one thing that I can say is our story empowered other people to step up and really look at the practices from appraisals that has negatively affected Black and brown people. It's the systems that has been created by white people for white people that continuously negatively affect people that look like me. So yes, on this day, I'm excited to be here because this can actually be something tangible to really help create change. So my daughter and my son won't have to go through the same things that me and my wife went through. If people could just imagine their home being devalued by $500,000 when all you're trying to do is make a better life for yourself, of how that makes you feel. It makes me angry. It makes me upset. There was times where I was physically so tied up that my stomach hurt, my head hurt, just because of what we went through. I don't wish that on anybody. There should be no reason why Black folks should be devalued in America today. Traditionally, it has constantly happened, but now it's time for us to take those steps and right the wrongs. This is the opportunity now for us to look at reparations or damages for what has been done to the Black American from the time we was brought here. We are the only race that have not had an opportunity to be given what we deserve for all that we have done here in the United States. We constantly live through trauma that's been passed down from generation to generation, but we also have been the resilient people to constantly help build and fight for America. So my story, I can directly look at my grandparents and the struggle they went through and look at the redlining issues that they had to deal with when they grew up. But for me to also have to deal with it 60 years later, 80 years later, it shouldn't constantly happen. We're in 2021 and this happened in 2019 to me. I do have one story I want to leave with. My grandparents was arguably the first Black people to build a home in Mill Valley, which is a neighboring white town right next to Marin City. The story that they told me, because it took me a while to understand, they had a driveway that was a 90-degree drop. Their house was in the hills, but they had a driveway that was a 90-degree drop. You could not see the house from the road. And when I asked them why, they told me, grandson, I had to build this home at night and on weekends so we wouldn't be detected, because they didn't want any Black families living in their city. And that sat with me for a long time. And while yet they had an opportunity to build that home, they had a white man who got the lumber for them. And this was in the 1950s. The lady who actually sold them the deed, she ended up getting blackballed years later, because they found out that she sold a home to a Black family. And that's always sat on me since I was like 10 years old. But then you fast forward 35 years later, and then I have to go through essentially the same thing. So now it's the time for folks to step up. California, do what's right. Give Black people what they deserve. I appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Alston, for that incredibly moving personal testimony. Now we would like to go to Dr. Terence Dean. Terence Dean, you may begin your testimony when you are ready. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Terence Dean. I'm an assistant professor here at Denison University. The work that I do, the research that I do, extends to Allensworth, California. One of the co-founders particularly, which happens to be William Payne, who is a Denison University graduate in 1906. We tell this story of William Payne as I want to illustrate what it means to be home, or locating a place called home. Often, as part of the American nostalgia, we fancy concepts and themes of home, a place where we can claim as a starting place, some form of identity of our location in America. We often return home as it provides memories, but more so, it is our story. It has a beginning, and home helps us to place a marker on our beginnings. And this is where this American odyssey begins for the hundreds of Black families of Allensworth, California, who unfortunately do not and cannot claim inheritance to a home that their ancestors created for them. In 1908, William Payne, like so many other exodusters who migrated to California, along with the Colonel Allen Allensworth, relocated from Ohio as a teacher to California seeking greater opportunities. Following in the footsteps of Booker T. Washington, who encouraged many other African Americans who were fleeing the South, but also building on Booker T. Washington's notion of comeuppance, but also building and having self-reliance for Black people in America. Booker T. Washington, who also founded Tuskegee Institute, now known as Tuskegee University, encouraged many Black Americans to go west. California would be the new odyssey for so many who were seeking refuge, a safe place, a haven, a place to call home. Following this, William Payne took his family and his two little daughters, his wife and his two daughters, to California seeking opportunities as a teacher. He arrives in 1908 in California, in 1906, in California. And there, when he applies to become a teacher in the state of California, they deny him a teaching license. We all understood that the tentacles of Jim Crow South had unfortunately made its way west. And this is where the story begins for William Payne and the Colonel. And in 1908, inspired again by the message and the economic self-sufficiency of Booker T. Washington, Colonel Allen Allensworth of Kentucky, one of the most distinguished Black men in the U.S. Army, along with Ohio educator William Payne, these two men set out to establish a town where, quote, African Americans would settle upon the bare desert and cause it to blossom as a rose, unquote. The American dream was within reach for them. They had beaten the odds against the ills of Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and segregation by migrating from the Midwest to California to build a home. And I want to read something very briefly from Allensworth, which is why I think this is more crucial and more important to this testimony and this story. In 1908, with William Payne and Colonel Allen Allensworth decided to co-found the town of Allensworth, Colonel Allensworth was so excited, he wrote to Booker T. Washington the following letter, and I quote it at length. He states, I take great pleasure in informing you that I have just completed an organization to be known as the California Colony and Home Promoting Association. The object of this association is to unite with you in creating favorable sentiment for the race. One of the chief purposes of this association will be to mold public opinion favorable to intellectual and industrial liberty. To this end, I have secured over 9,000 acres of the richest land in Central California, where the colony will be located on the main line of the Santa Fe Railroad. A town will be established upon the most scientific bases and improved methods of a city and of buildings. As it is just as cheap to build right as wrong, we will commence with the ownership of public utilities. We intend to demonstrate to the world that we can be and do, thus meeting the expectation of our friends and to encourage our people to develop the best there is in them under the most favorable conditions of mind and body. This we have in California, as you are aware. It is my desire to have our streets given names of historical and educational value. And in the midst of this city, we will have a lake surrounded by a park to be named, if you have no objection, Washington Park, in honor of the greatest Negro sentiment maker in the world. Have you no objection? Respectfully yours, Allen Allensworth. Now, of course, Booker T. Washington turned down something like that, right? Who would not want to have a park named after them? And particularly someone who was one of the most critical voices of African Americans and comeuppance during our time. However, the story would take a tragic turn once settlers began settling within Allensworth. But let's talk about the glory moments of Allensworth. The town, which served as a transfer point on the Santa Fe Railroad, it was the only transfer point from Los Angeles going to Fresno, going towards the Bakersfield, went upwards to Oakland. Travelers would stop, transfer, and visit Allensworth, purchasing goods and services in the town. Allensworth was anchored by over 800 acres devoted to cultivating sugar, wheat, barley, cotton, and poultry, and that was sold to neighboring towns along the Santa Fe Railroad. The Cali would soon become a depot for grain, for cattle merchants, and those who provided a steady stream for business for their hotels, their restaurants, their livery stable. And only a year after its founding, they had a post office. Now, here's where the story takes a very unique turn as well. By 1912, Allensworth was made into a voting district and a school district. And with $5,000, around $300,000 in today's dollars, they built a 2-room public school. And William Payne, who was denied his teaching license when he first arrived in California, would now become the first teacher and principal of the Allensworth School. He had received his teaching license. So they did exactly what Booker T. Washington encouraged them to do. They followed the American dream. They created a colony just for themselves to help preserve not only for themselves, but others to come along after them. So in addition to becoming their own independent town, they had a functioning general store, a drug and pharmacy store, a hotel that housed travelers and transient business people. In essence, it was a shining example of Black self-sufficiency and prosperity. And unfortunately, that would be its biggest problem. As Allensworth prospered, the town became the target of various different business interests. Now, originally, when they bought the land through their own private company from the Pacific Farming Company, the Pacific Farming Company and the Pacific Water Company had promised Allensworth 10 wells, just as they did the other neighboring white towns. Unfortunately, Allensworth only received 4 wells. Those 4 wells would not be able to sustain a growing colony that was moving quickly and growing fastly. So they sued the California Farming Company as well as the Pacific Water Company in order to regain ownership of those wells, but also to get additional wells. Well, unfortunately, Pacific Water Company did not enact or give them their additional wells, but they did, were sued and they lost the litigation. And they did have to turn over the wells to Allensworth. And unfortunately, the town was not able to build enough and sustain itself because they didn't have the adequate filtering pumps and all the other necessary equipment because the Pacific Farming Water Company had not provided them with those resources. Another key element that happened during the time, the Santa Fe Railway. As I mentioned earlier, it was the only stop along the way from Los Angeles to Oakland. Additionally, what happened is that the Santa Fe Railway, they had petitioned the colony members of Allensworth. Is it possible that we can hire Santa Fe Railway any Black persons? Because at that time, they had not any Black persons working on the Santa Fe Railway. And Allensworth was the most popular stop So they asked if they could hire someone to ride that line, or at least hire someone Black to be a ticket agent to take tickets at Allensworth. Santa Fe Railway denied that request. But what they did do is they built another depot stop in Alpal, the neighboring white town. And with that, the trains began to divert all services, preventing any economic continuance of self-sustaining sustainability at Allensworth, moving all of its businesses to Alpal. That would decimate the community of Allensworth. So denying the town access to water, which was critical, and the water table, it continued to decline, and a more developed water supply would have been necessary to sustain this town. And unfortunately, because of the Pacific Farming Company failures to dig necessary wells to provide other essential infrastructure improvements, the citizens of Allensworth, unfortunately, did not have the wherewithal for their farmers and agricultural sustainability to help the town continue to grow. With the Santa Fe Railroad continuing to divert its trains from Allensworth to Alpal, it also decimated the community's economic sustainability. And this is one of the other critical components, is unfortunately in 1919, the colonel himself was walking in the streets on a business trip in Los Angeles, California, and was struck and killed by a motorcyclist. It was discovered that the motorcyclists were two white men who had struck the colonel. They don't know what the charges were, or if any charges could be found, if it was malicious intent, but unfortunately the colonel would die the next day of his injuries. What does this mean when we talk about home? Home for those who were in a community living the American dream. Just as sure the Black communities of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Rosewood, Florida, and those who massacred those communities by white mobs who were angered by Black thriving and success and achievement, Allensworth unfortunately suffered their fate through the destructive practices in a systemic manner, economically and of infrastructure through the transportation industry. How do we reconciliate and help those who have moved on, the descendants who are still living, many of them in the California area, who are seeking some type of sustainability to remind themselves of the community of their forefathers and their foremothers who created a place called home that you know of as Allensworth. When we think of reparations, we think of those who have been disproportionately economically, judiciously, and politically disenfranchised by a system based on race, culture, and other markers which deem them inferior. Those persons in Allensworth were displaced from their land, a land that they bought legally and with hard-earned money. Although, unfortunately, through racist and implicit biases based on race, it does not mean that it is a forfeiture of their land. But what it does mean in today's terms is a reclamation, a returning, a sojourn to those and the descendants of Allensworth. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Terence Dean, for that moving, informative expert testimony. So now it is 2:00 and we have 20 minutes reserved for questions and comments from our task force members to our esteemed panelists. So at this time, would a task force member like to be recognized to share a comment or question? Member Reggie Jones Sawyer, you are recognized.
So this was very good, and I actually want to kind of point out with Mr. Austin. Mr. Austin, because of your family and your family's courage, hello, and your courage to come forward, Assemblymember Chris Holden brought forth AB Assembly Bill 948, which will require the Bureau of California Real Estate Appraisers to gather data on demographic information of buyers and sellers of real estate property and to compile a database of homeowners from protected classes who file complaints based on low appraisals. The legislation also requires appraisers to take anti-bias training when renewing their license. I mention that because this bill was actually signed into law, and it's because of your family and being lowballed by nearly $500,000 was the impetus for this legislation. And so I also want to just show how legislation can also help. And when we start looking at reparations and turning things around, and you're a perfect example, especially with your compelling story, of how we can also use legislation to turn a lot of this around. And so I just want to make sure we commend you and your family for stepping forward and having the ingenuity to do what you did, because I think at the end of the day, and I know it will help a lot of families who are in similar situations. So thank you.
Thank you, Member Reggie Jones-Sawyer. Member Javon Scott Lewis, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chair Moore. I want to thank all of the panelists for their presentations. As much as this has, been meant to be, a discussion on the wealth gap, what this panel presented was a very clear and beautiful and intentionally poetic. Thank you, Ms. Ward, for helping us to realize the importance of placemaking in this entire process. And so when we're thinking about home, right, when we're thinking about the kinds of attachments that Black people have had to make and remake in this country's history, what we're seeing, across today's presentations are the cost of that process. And there is, I don't know, I can't see him any longer, but Professor Cramer isn't, I don't know if he's still here, but I don't see him on my screen. So what Professor Cramer has added to, to that, oh, there you are, okay, thank you for coming back to us. So what you've helped to add is the quantification, right, of that investment. And so, I have, I guess, a couple of questions, which is, how do we think about the migration, right? How do we think about the impulse, the need to migrate as a kind of economic cost, and the idea of African Americans' continued resettlement, right, through that migratory process, within your calculations, Dr. Cramer, right? So again, right, we're seeing a history here, right? And I love the fact that you called it the startup capital, because you're using language that I think, our contemporary moment demands and can easily recognize. But if we're thinking about the investments that African Americans made in the Southern plantation economies, right? And, Mr. Austin talked about his family, right, migrating over to California, right, working in the shipyard. So we're thinking again about these investments that are being made in these burgeoning industries, even here in the West. Then what we're seeing, right, is this parallel charting, right, of the investment into industry alongside this really important process of emplacement. And then when the industries erode, right, again, once the plantation economy is eroded, right, through emancipation, through Reconstruction, and ultimately the failure of Reconstruction failed to guarantee a promise of home for Blacks in the South. They migrate for other opportunities, right, to various places. That Dr. Dean really did a wonderful job through the Exoduster movement, etc. But I'm trying to get a sense of here is how do we think about the relationship between what feels like a very hard economic, investment in these various industries, alongside the more intimate attachments to the places that Black communities invest in. Because I think when we're trying to understand reparations, we're thinking about the input and the output, right? In an earlier panel, we talked about how some of the, I think it was actually yesterday, right? How Black people are facing both ends of the kind of, the issue of environmental racism, right? Meaning they are facing the dispossession, the displacement, right, as a result of the industries that are polluting the neighborhoods. They are also there, with their labors contributing to the rise of those industries. So we're seeing this in multiple ways. In other words, we're seeing the same relationship show up as a kind of pattern. And so I want to kind of think about that, right, in a way that responds to, what Kavon showed us today, right? What Paul has showed us today, which are these intimate investments. I don't want us to just get lost in the numbers, but I want us to kind of use the numbers to try and help to respond to, right, the kind of lived experiences and the investments that are made kind of across the board. So it's really a comment, right? There isn't an answer that I'm asking for any of you to provide for me, but I just want to try and point to and bring some significance to the relationship between these things, right? Again, the hard economic inputs and outputs of Black labor and migration, but also, right, the more intimate costs that are, related to that migration. Because then we see this again showing up with gentrification, with more immediate kinds of dispossessions that are a part of this really long, right, history of incorporation when it is opportune and expulsion when it is opportune, right? And so I want us to kind of think about that relationship throughout, because I've now seen a very clear pattern across really several of our panels. Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Vice Chair Brown, you are recognized.
Madam Chair, members of our task force, again, thank you, the staff and your leadership for bringing such knowledgeable, expert, and I would guess humane presentations. And what I want to advance further is from the testimony that we just heard regarding Allensworth and these assessors devaluing that which we own. In a deeper sense, this oppression, this brutality against our humanity has denied us the human right to have a sense of place, It has rendered us an invisible people. How so? Number one, the destruction of Allensworth, a community that was created in order that we would be able to excel in spite of the hellishness of oppression, of segregation, and insult. Yes, it was public policy that destroyed it. Then we have the redevelopment agencies that, through public policy, pushed us out and said, you will not have a watering hole. You will not have a meeting place, a place. Going back in history, thank God for the Jewish community that pushed for its place. And of course, Palestinians deserve their place too. But the point I'm making is that at the base of Judaism, it's Zion. It's the Holy Land that we call it. Not much real estate, on about, I guess, as far as from here to Sacramento and down to Monterey, excuse me. But it's about a place. And these areas where we have lost our place, the Fillmore, the Harlem of the West, We should have ours too. As the sister said, Mama may have, Papa may have, but God bless the child has got his own. Japanese communities went through their pain that was wrong. And in San Francisco, there's Japantown. There's also Chinatown. There's also Little Italy. But Black folks are the only ones who, through public policy, even though we have, through ingenuity and skill and having pit bulldog determination, have created the Rosewoods, Greenwood, and the Fillmore. But it was through this public policy and public actions that destroyed our sense of place and humanity. That's what's done a lot of psychological injury and pain to Black folks. Yes, we know how to be world citizens, we know how to reach out to others, but to deny us again, even after the hellish moments of slavery, enslavement, a place. Therefore, we ought to call for the revitalizations of all of these places that became our sense of place, our watering hole. And that includes Allensworth, the Fillmore, and down in Los Angeles. You know what I'm talking about. I hope we will fight that battle and make sure we have not only our individual real estate through correcting these restricted covenants and the pain that they cause, but making sure that we fight for our place.
Thank you, Vice Chair Brown. Member Holder, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair Moore. I do want to echo the sentiments of my fellow members. I think one of the through lines in all of these presentations has been so much about how, even though as Black people, we've been destabilized, there have been concerted efforts to disenfranchise us, through it all, we retain our agency, ingenuity, and we push back. I mean, the story that Professor Dean told us about Allensworth, that is a story in many ways of triumph, of pushing back. You know, what Ms. Ward talked about and the way that she presented the story of Bruce's Beach, and ending with that incredibly powerful drop the mic moment poetry. You know, that is us as a people pushing back against these constant forces that continue to destabilize us. You know, the speaker who presented on his own personal experience of, you know, being completely alienated in this housing industry, you know, where they're literally trying to take all his equity, his hard-earned equity away. He fought back. He showed agency and fought back against this system that is bombarding us. So that's the through line that I'm seeing in all of these stories. Now, I want to get to my question for all of you. You know, I think that belonging is something that we are all witnessing in these stories. This African Americans, we keep fighting for a sense of belonging in this country, right? And one of the things that this commission has to do, one of our awesome responsibilities, one of many, is to decide who is the community of eligibility, right? Who should get reparations? And it's going to be an ongoing debate about how we formulate that. And I have concerns about formulating it in a way that is so narrow that it creates divisions among African Americans and Black people and people in the diaspora, almost all of whom experienced slavery through their ancestry, whether it was in the United States, whether it was in South America, whether it was in the Caribbean. Our ancestors were dragged from Africa. Our ancestors were enslaved, whether it was in the United States, or whether it was in Trinidad or in Haiti or in Brazil. And so, and moreover, the community of reparations is an international community. It is an international movement. And the thought leaders around the issue of reparations come from all around the globe. And so I'm fearful of having a very isolationist perspective on reparations in this process, where reparations only goes to a tiny sector of the community who can directly trace and document their descendancy from African Americans who were enslaved in the United States. I have concerns about that very, very narrow construction. My question, particularly to Ms. Ward, because your comments resonated with me, is how do you think such a narrow construction around reparations would impact the sense of belonging for all people of African descent in the United States, who whether or not they descended directly from a slave who was in the United States, have the experience of enslavement in their past? How do you think limiting the construction around this community of eligibility would impact that larger diaspora of Africans in the Americas?
I mean, I think it'll divide us, and I think when we're having this conversation around reparations, it should not be something that divides us. It should be something that brings us together. And I just go back to just like what we're experiencing now in this country. It's not tied to just African Americans. When police pull you over, they don't say, when they pull a Jamaican person over, they don't say, oh, you're Jamaican, so I'm not going to treat you as harshly as an African American. They don't know the difference. You're still marginalized. And so and that's why I proposed some type of tiered method. I don't know how that would work, but something that acknowledges the marginalization that they're experiencing now and that they've experienced since they've been in the United States. Some of them are even born here, so I don't know. I am just not a proponent of closing it off that way and limiting it that way either. It's very divisive.
Oh, you're on mute, Member Holder.
I was wondering if Dr. Dean had a comment on that, Dr. Kramer.
Dr. Dean?
One of the difficulties and challenges that I faced, like I said, tracing William Payne's lineage and history, who was a direct descendant of slavery. I was able to find his parents who were enslaved in Virginia, and then to trace his history. So that's connecting him directly to Allensworth. So I wonder how many others, and we can also connect, the Colonel himself, Colonel Allen Allensworth, who escaped slavery himself and creates his own town. So he becomes a modern day savior for himself, but also a modern day savior of reimagining post-slavery, a land for freedom. And for those of you who are familiar with enslaved persons who escaped slavery in the South, Maroonage, they were called Maroonages, where Black people lived. So we have like the Gullah Geechee Islands, like now we have in South Carolina. So the fact that they would have this forethought to keep creating land for themselves and rebuilding in spaces, and now doing it through the legitimacy of the state and working in cooperation with the state, but does the state then thus is cooperative with them? what happens to them and their land now, because that land technically still belongs to those who, found Allensworth and their descendants. It's now owned by the state of California state parks. So, but the challenge I'm raising here is how do we decide the reparations for those descendants who don't even know they're the descendants? The state park has had a difficult challenge of locating those who lived there at one point, because so many of them, once they left Allensworth, they did not keep track. There were no tracking mechanisms available to know where they went. If they went back to Los Angeles, did they go to Bakersfield? Did they go to Oakland, San Francisco? We don't know where those families went. So the difficulty there would be trying to locate those family members, and then also doing the necessary work of ensuring that they have ownership and access to those reparations connected to slavery and enslavement. But I'm pretty sure their ancestors who were exodusters, who were probably migrating from the Midwest as well, and the South. So we can definitely find some work with that, but that's going to take a lot of work,
You are recognized.
Thank you. I realize that we are at or a couple of minutes past time. So I'd like to share the questions and ask if there is not enough time for our witnesses to speak to the questions now, that perhaps they could get the information to the DOJ staff. So I had a
Grills.
Yes.
I'll just say the next item on our agenda, which is adoption of findings, which is 30 minutes long. That's actually a moot point. We won't be discussing that based on the vote that we took yesterday. And so we do have a bit of time left for panelists to answer questions if the panelists themselves have, 15, 20 minutes to spare. So yes, I didn't mean to interrupt your train of thought. Continue with your questions.
Thank you so much. And Professor Dean, you kind of sort of answered my question, but just in case, and I'll put all three questions out at one time. Do you have a sense of how many descendants remain in Allensworth, and are they an organized body, or are they becoming an organized body on their own behalf? And then Professor Cramer, in a book, I think it's Fortunes of Africa, if my memory serves me right, the author offered a projection of about 228 years on how long it would take to bridge the wealth gap between whites and blacks due to enslavement. This, I believe, is based on if nothing were done, no reparations, no public policies to correct racist de jure and de facto practices. So based on your analysis, if nothing were done, how long would it take to achieve just basic wealth equity? And then finally for, two more, for Ms. Ward, do you have other Black families that have had experiences similar to the Bruce family and that may be seeking redress? So I'm just so that we have a sense, how many families are in similar situations that are in the process of beginning their work to achieve justice? And then lastly, for Mr. Austin, has there been any organizing in your neighborhood, community organizing I'm speaking of, resulting in a sense of how many families or how many people may have had a similar experience to yours, whether it was through appraisal processes or showing homes or trying to sell homes or blocking the sale of homes? Are there specific realty companies that are implicated now? And how much loss have families incurred as a result of these kinds of practices? Has any organizing happened to try to gather that information?
I guess I can go first if you want, or would you like to go first, Mr. Kramer?
No, go ahead.
And so in terms of California, there is another family, the Prelude family. They actually own plots of land, a plot of land on Bruce's Beach Park. But because that land is owned by the city of Manhattan Beach, we weren't able to do anything for that family. And in terms of nationally, yes, we've got about close to 100 families who have reached out to us and asked for our help. And the first family that we're really focusing advocacy attention on is Winston Willis, this family. He was, he's out of Cleveland, Ohio. He was a Black business owner, owned several properties, over 20 properties in Cleveland, Ohio. And the land was essentially all of his businesses were taken from him, and many of them by Cleveland Clinic. So, I mean, this is an epidemic. This is happening nationally. And so, I mean, I can give you more details if people send you more details if you'd like, Dr. Grills. But yeah, we've got a lot of work to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I may try to answer the question about the wealth gap, how long it would take to close without any action being taken. I'm actually afraid, and I don't have the hard data to support this, but I can certainly do some research on it if you would like me to do that. I'm afraid that it might actually grow larger because the wealth gap grew larger through the New Deal era and the post-war era. So there is a tendency of inheritances that were derived from slavery and are handed down generally in white families to increase exponentially through compound interest. And that those inheritances are missing in the hands of Black families. So the gap would tend to grow larger rather than closing by itself. So I think it really takes a massive effort like reparations to close it. And that's why I was also arguing, I think that closing the wealth gap should be a minimum first step. And then there are other considerations like that were mentioned by several speakers before about losses after slavery and New Deal era and redlining and the examples of losing a sense of place and of home. Those should be quantified as well. I don't have the expertise to do that, but I think it's absolutely fair to consider reparations as a beginning part of the debate, not as a closing part, not a payment kind of hush money, you know, we pay and then we never talk about it again, but rather the beginning of an honest coping with history. And that's how it was in Germany. The reparations were paid beginning in 1952. But the debate about what Germany's past looked like began really in earnest in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, when school curricula were changed so the coping with history should be an ongoing process.
Thank you.
No problem. So yes, so there has been quite a bit of movement since our story came out about our house being, just the appraisal coming out as such a very low number, significantly low at $500,000, that the brother Julian Glover from Channel 7 News people have been reaching out to him left and right, wanting to tell their story. So at least know in the Bay Area, he's covered at least 7 other stories. But it will take a committee to get together to really look at the appraisal business. And so currently, there's not, it's like we're right at the beginning. Like the story is just now being told. So I know within our community, no, we have not had an opportunity to really galvanize people, for people to start looking at their loans, looking at their appraisals, comparing them with others. When I say others, I mean white folks that have bought homes in the area, to really look and see what's going on in this industry that's not serving Black and brown people correctly. And so hopefully from this platform, It will give us some legs, give us some momentum, be able to bring in some specialists to really look at what's going on, especially in the Bay Area where I live personally, to really look at seeing why are people property, especially Black folks, why are their property being devalued at such a large and alarming number? So yes, so hopefully this is a catalyst for change, but I do know right now it's not that, we don't have a committee of people that can dive into that work. It's going to take some resources, some experts to really get in and try and, dismantle this system that's not working.
Thank you.
To Mr. Austin's point, here, I'm in Ohio. They have a task force that they created in Ohio on redlining, the redlining district that has happened for a lot of families, particularly those who were, their appraisals were underappraised. So they're going back, and they are, the county's accountant or something like that is looking into this. They created a task force. They went back through all the paperwork to see, yes, Black families' homes were underappraised. So I raised the question. I said, well, how does the system change? Because he said, well, we're going to put new appraisers out there, and so we're trying not to have that practice continue. I said, well, did you change the system of how these practices have? It doesn't matter if the person is racist or not. If the system has not changed, then they're still enacting the same systems that have already been in place since the 1960s, 70s, when they already undervalued Black people's homes. My second question was, are you going to compensate those people for their homes for being undervalued? They hadn't even got to that point yet. They were like, we don't know. So no, and then what are you going to do with the banks? Are the banks how are they going to be taken made accountable for all of this as well? So there's a thread that we have to follow here. So I hope that they would do something like that, create a task force in the state of California. We get all these people who are complicit, to take ownership and also, again, to do some type of reconciliation in regards to that. But in regards to Dr. Grill's point in Allensworth, the great thing is that a lot of the people who lived at Allensworth at one point were upper middle class or middle class Blacks who were of note. So the great thing is we can trace some of their lineage based on their names in the industries that they were part of. One was Oscar Over, who was the first Black Chief Justice in the state of California. So with that information, yes, we can trace some persons back through their industry. Again, the Colonel himself was a lieutenant in the Army. So we can trace his lineage. William Payne, obviously he was an educator. We were able to trace his lineage. A lot of the persons who lived in Allensworth at that time were of note and of great industry in California. So we can trace some of them. And also farmers, because farmers had to, identify the paperwork through the acreage and lands that they had as well. So we can do some of that work, again, but it's just creating a team. Unfortunately, the California State Park shared with me, they don't have the resources to do that type of work. I'm a one-man operation. I was able to track down one person, as I said, William Payne. But I'll be more than happy to track down more and do more work. But I think I don't think the work is not unattainable. It is attainable to achieve.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
I didn't mean to cut you off, Member Grills. Vice Chair Brown, you are recognized.
Yes, Madam Chair, members of the task force, we not consider that we have resources right before our noses, and we should not assume that we can't find the record. A case in point, in 2010, when the Third Baptist Church had a historic institution, we were about to celebrate again the typical Easter and Palm Sunday. What did I say as pastor? It's all right if you're a Christian or whatever. But have you thought about there is a history of your own people? What did I do? I got some scholars come from Washington, D.C. on Palm Sunday morning and did an African ancestry research program. Went all the way back to Africa and established my roots. Number two, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has the largest bank of family research methodology in the world. Number three, they just reached out to the national NAACP after a conversation of 2.5 years. And an collaborative experience was established. And they committed, as a church, $12.5 million to the NAACP to do several initiatives. But the one that, I'm not being self-serving, I'm just talking about what I'm talking about. They also established a Dr. Amos C. Brown Scholars Program. And in that program, this coming 2022, we will take a minimum of 50 young people to Ghana, West Africa. It's paid by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, $250,000, who will go there and see ground zero of this evil, this brutal Atlantic slave trade. And they will come back as ambassadors for racial reconciliation and social justice. Young people from high school, college, and seminary. So we can do it. And there are records that are available. So I think we need to get it out of our minds that we can search, and particularly with the Freedmen's Bureau records being brought on. What does this do in the process? Help us as a people to have rituals of remembrances. We don't need to be shortchanging ourselves by having African American History Month. It used to be African American History Week. And let me say something else real quick. Many of us don't know that Carter G. Woodson was not the first great Black historian. It was a man named the Reverend George Washington Williams, who pastored, by the way, the same church, Union Baptist of Cincinnati, Ohio, that Colonel Allensworth pastored to. And the first Black pastor of Third Baptist Church, Charles Satchel, W.B. Du Bois' wife. He came over the Oregon Trail in 1856. I'm citing all this to say there's a whole lot of stuff that's around. All we got to do is just claim it and not assume that we can't get the records. We can. If we have the will and the support of others who see the vision.
Thank you, Vice Chair Brown. So I realize it's 2:40 and I want to be respectful of the time for the panelists. I did have 2 questions that I wanted to pose, and then I'll leave it up to other task force members in the event they have any last questions for the panelists. So for Dr. Kramer, I don't remember who it was that called via public comment this morning, but I did make note of the question. And you already kind of spoke to it in your presentation, but the question was, what is reparations, and how do you think it could be distributed, And then also in your statement, could you speak to, the conversation that we seem to be having right now around the community of eligibility, and if your work with, Kristen Mullen or Sandeep Darity has informed who you think be eligible for reparations in the state? And I'll wait for that. Go ahead.
Should I go ahead? Great. Thank you for that question. It was Charisse Cryer this morning in the public comments phase. And I noticed her questions with some trepidation because this is a minefield that I'm very reluctant to enter, especially since I'm not part of the descendant community. And I think that the question who should be eligible and what reparations should be, so the modalities, that should be really determined by the descendant community, not by myself. But what I can offer is some personal opinions that I would at the same time ask the task force to disregard, if I can do that. The eligibility criteria, I am, through my collaboration with Professor Darity and Kirsten Mullen, I'm very familiar with their definition of 12 years defining as African American on public documents like in the census, and having an ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. To me, that seems fair because it is the group that was mostly ignored by previous attempts at racial justice policies. And as as was sometimes said in the debate, I listened to it yesterday with great interest. Other groups could take this as a precedent and then claim their own reparations cases. So I don't necessarily find it divisive to look at the ADOS definition. But again, I don't think that's my place to make any recommendations. So this is just a personal opinion that I invite you to disregard. Regarding the modalities, what reparations should be, I guess I would offer this consideration to look at precedents for reparations. And one case that I'm thinking about is Japanese American World War II internee reparations, which were paid in the form of a check and a letter of apology to each of the eligible respondents. And there is more precedent, for example, for slavery reparations, actually, under the wrong heading, where actually slave owners received reparations for the abolition of slavery. And these slave owners received cash payments, including from the federal government of the United States when slavery was abolished in the District of Columbia during the Civil War. They received $300 per enslaved person, and that was paid out of the, if I understand it correctly, out of the regular budget of the United States at the height of the Civil War, when every penny counted for the defense of the Union. I find that remarkable. And I checked a number of cases, almost 149 or 50 cases of countries that largely paid reparations to slave owners. And some did it through taking large loans and paying them off over centuries, like Great Britain or France or Haiti did. And others gave out bonds and so on. There is various constructions. But there is precedence for this, so that I think we don't have to reinvent the wheel from scratch. So with this, I'll shut up, and I invite you to disregard my personal opinions on these matters.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Kramer. Thank you for that. So I had a follow-up question. It's for Kavon Ward. So and this is a question specifically about Bruce speech. So under international law, right, there's 5 forms of reparations. There's compensation, restitution, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. So in the specific context of Bruce Beach, right, the Bruce family received reparations in the form of restitution from LA County, right? Not necessarily Manhattan Beach. And you said in your opening remarks, right, Manhattan Beach hasn't really fully atoned, if at all, for what they did to the Bruce family. So again, going back to my original point, right, the Bruce family received their land back. So under international law, that is a form of reparations under the form of restitution. However, international law, requires for reparations to be fully comprehensive, reparations should come in all 5 of those forms. It should come in the form of restitution, which accounts for stolen land and stolen wealth, stolen intellectual property, you name it. But it should also account for reparations in the form of compensation, which is money, rehabilitation, which accounts for mental damage or mental harm, satisfaction, which would mean like a full and comprehensive apology of some sort from the institutions or entities involved, and then guarantees of non-repetition, which is a guarantee from the entity that harmed, that they would guarantee to not harm the victim group in the future. So, I understand you're not necessarily a representative for the Bruce family, but you have worked intimately with them. I was at the ceremony and I saw Senator Bradford speak, and I saw you speak, and it was great. And so I'm curious to know, in your conversations with the Bruce family, if you can share, do they have this notion that there should be more, that they should be given, not only, just their land back, but maybe those other forms of reparations as well, accounting for, like I said, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees upon repetition?
Absolutely.
From LA County from LA County and or Manhattan Beach and or the state at large, because there's a lot of different entities in play.
Absolutely. I think I spoke to this in my remarks. They are definitely looking for restitution in the form of compensation for lost business enterprise, for violation of human and civil rights. And I think the expectation comes from the city of Manhattan Beach. I think that the county has done all they could have done in terms of giving the land back to the family or agreeing to restore the land back to the family. But now it's the responsibility of the city to do its part. In terms of what the expectation, or if there is an expectation of the state of California to do anything, you would have to ask them that. I'm not sure, but I know that they are looking for the city to pay restitution, to compensate them. And I'd also add that, there's a lot of conversation going on about like this definition of what reparations is, right? And a lot of people tend to monetize it more than anything, and don't like to call land restoration reparations. But I am of the belief that reparations is anything that you provide to repair the damage done. And so for me, this is reparations. And I'm not sure that breaking it down to me, it's like, for me, it's not so much restitution, it's restoration. It's reparations, but in the form of land restoration. And so when we say we exist, Justice for Bruce's Beach exists to get restoration and restitution for the family, we're not looking at the restoration of the land as restitution. We're looking at compensation as restitution.
And if I may add, which I think is excellent, an excellent question, which is why I was very intentional around saying reconciliation, reconcile, because I think that plays a huge part in this conversation as well when we talk about reparations. If you look at Brian Stevenson and what he did in Alabama, the Truth and Reconciliation form that he did with those who were lynched during the period of lynching. But also, I was thinking about South Africa and Nelson Mandela, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and their work around reconciliation, of restoring back to those who were victimized during apartheid, and also the land and all those other things, how you restore people back and make them whole again. Those who exploited and made use of the exploitation, how do they reconcile? Like the onus is back on them. The forgiveness, so a public apology or apology to the individual themselves. So that's why I use the term reconciliation and reconcile.
Thank you for that, Dr. Dean and Ms. Ward. Are there any other questions or comments from the task force members on recognizing our time? Well, thank you again to our esteemed panelists, particularly thank you, Mr. Austin, Mr. Ward, Professor Cramer, Professor Dean. This was absolutely outstanding, and we truly, truly appreciate the testimony that you all provided us today.
Thank you. I do appreciate being here.
Absolutely, thank you. So it is now 2:52. And again, just to make an announcement, agenda item number 17, which was supposed to be an action item, adoption of findings, which was supposed to run from 2:30 to 3 p.m. is, we're no longer going to discuss that. It's a moot action item because we took action on this yesterday. And so that is no longer an item of discussion or action today. So we will move forward to agenda item number 18, which is an action item agenda for the December hearing. So at this time, I would ask a request for the staff, if could you kindly place on the screen the tentative agenda that staff prepared for the December hearing. And as we're waiting for staff to put on the screen that agenda, I just want to remind members of the task force of that agenda. Also remind members of the task force that, the public agenda proposal the public hearing proposal that we adopted was a tentative public hearing proposal with the caveat or notion that it can be amended by task force members at any time. So again, as we're waiting for staff to pull up that document, I just want to remind members of the public and the task force that our next meeting is scheduled to occur December 8th and 9th. When we voted on the agenda, we decided that day one, so December 8th, we would talk about issues related to infrastructure, gentrification, homelessness, and public health. And then day two would be reserved to topics surrounding entertainment, arts, sports, and culture. Okay, great. And so if we can get a side-by-side to see two pages at once, that would be great. If not, that is okay as well. But something that before I get to that, I just want to say for these next 30 minutes as a task force, we're putting out there who we may want to bring in and invite as panelists for the next hearing, what additional topics, if any, that we want to include. Do we want to change up entirely the topics for the next meeting? Those are some of the three things. So again, we're at the next 30 minutes or so, we're facilitating a discussion among the members about any adjustments to the hearing topics, feedback on potential witnesses, and additional topics for consideration by the task force. Now, in looking at the agenda, I realized that staff placed the hearing on the panel on entertainment, arts, and culture as just one panel. So it appears that day one is going to be talking about gentrification and homelessness and infrastructure. Then day 2, there's a conversation on public health, and then the second panel and the last panel of the day on day 2 is about entertainment, arts, and culture. And so I was wondering, in terms of the pre-planning, was that because we anticipate that we may not be able to get some very high-profile names for the full day if we allow for the entertainment, arts, sports, and media section to be a full day? But I think that we should have education, infrastructure, homelessness, and public health in one day, and then entertainment, arts, media, and sports in another day. But I'd be interested in hearing from other task force members what they think about that. Or do you think it should stay as is, with us having like 1 hour and 30 minutes to talk about entertainment, arts, and culture on the second day? Member Girls, you're recognized.
So, Mark, I'm not so sure about the entertainment, arts, and sports, and I'm actually less inclined to want to hear from like popular figures in entertainment, but more from folks who are actually involved in trying to address the many forms of racism that are manifesting themselves, for example, in film and television and production processes, et cetera. But before even getting to that, I'm unclear about what is being captured under the category on day 1 of public health, because I don't see physical health and mental health reflected anywhere in our list of topics over the course of the next year and a half. And medicine and mental health are not the same as public health. And I know that for, I think it's the meeting number 8 in August, September 2022, day 2 has mental health, psychological harm listed, but I think that's within the context of looking at reparation in the forms of what's restitution and rehabilitation. So that's not necessarily the same thing. So could someone clarify for me what is under the category of public health? And if it does not include mental health and medical issues, then I think we've left a gaping hole in our topics of coverage. If it is being included, then I still have a challenge, because that's not going to be enough time to cover 3 incredibly dense and serious issues with lots of findings waiting to be had.
Chair, if I could be recognized.
Go ahead, Member Holder.
Dr. Groves, I absolutely agree with you. I think with all of the recent studies coming out about tremendous amounts of bias in the field of medicine and the terrible outcomes that it is having in terms of infant mortality for Black babies, mortality for Black mothers, birthing mothers, tremendous disparities in life expectancy, and studies about how medical students, current medical students, 50% of them believe that African Americans have thicker skin than non-African Americans, and how that is impacting the type of medical treatment that African Americans as a community are receiving from doctors and future doctors. So I think we're seeing the most grotesque disparities and the most ardent implicit bias bubbling up in the field of medicine. I think we need a day just to talk about medicine and mental health. And also add in historical aspects of that. I'd like to hear about the eugenics and sterilization programs, those movements, and how they continue to impact the framework in the medical community. So I completely agree with you. And so if we need to take some time to restructure, I propose that we do that while we have the time allocated to us.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and to comment to that, I absolutely agree. There definitely needs to be an intentional conversation around those topics. In terms of public health, there is an article that was released last year, and it was pretty a groundbreaking article in the field of medicine and public health. It was published by the New England Journal of Medicine. And the title of the article is Reparations as a Public Health Priority, a Strategy for Ending Black-White Health Disparities. It was written by two doctors, Mary T. Bassett and Sandro Galea. And in the article, they discuss, right, reparations as a public health priority, but they also talk about, infant mortality and issues surrounding that. But notably, in the article, there isn't necessarily a conversation about mental health. And so, yes, so we do have 30 minutes left if we wanted to take any action around restructuring the December hearing to account for a discussion on mental health, or taking a long view, right? The initial 10 meeting proposal that we came up with and tentatively voted for was based on the notion that we only had 10 meetings, right? But we know we've had these meetings virtually. We have up to 10 meetings that we can be reimbursed for, but we haven't, utilized that yet because we've all been meeting virtually. So we can add a whole new day, right? Between now and our December hearing, or between the December hearing and then our next hearing, which would be February 2022, to talk about any issue we want, but particularly the issues that member groups and member holder raised. Just putting those out there as alternatives, and that if at any point a member would like to take action, I will entertain a motion on that. Do any other members have any feedback, right, on what we see on the screen so far in terms of the December hearing and witnesses and additional topics for consideration for the December hearing or hearings in general?
Chair Moore, this is Michael Newman in the DOJ. I don't know if you can hear me or see me, but
Mr. Newman, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. One of the things that we talked about yesterday was agendizing the review and approval of the outlines, which would also, as a point of order, the schedule that we talked about in the last meeting would call for the outlines to be reviewed during the next meeting. So I think we have a slide where I can talk about that. And I was asked, I believe, by member Grills or member Tamaki or member Holder, there was a number of discussions about a proposal from the DOJ with regard to the review and approval of the outlines and the draft. And that would need to be factored into the December meeting agenda as well. And so if I may, I'd like to present on that right now, just to provide more information for your conversation on the agendizing.
Sure.
Okay, thank you very much. So as I mentioned, we talked about a proposal based on a motion that carried by the task force, instructing us to provide outlines and then a final draft for votes by the task force. Based on the current meeting schedule, which I understand you're reviewing right now. So we based our dates on the current meeting schedule. We would need to reserve time on December 7th. So just to recap, you all have a number of the outlines already, and we've asked for feedback, and we want extensive feedback. These outlines should reflect the task force's conclusions and findings through this process. We want to make sure that the outlines that we're developing the draft on for the task force to actually, generate the report from are reflective of the task force members' positions and feelings and reflections on what we've all been hearing. So we have half of the outlines are already out. We're waiting for input. We will be redoubling efforts in the next couple of weeks to get the rest of the outlines done, ideally by mid-November in advance of the December hearing, so that you all will have time with the outlines. We would then have the December 7th and 8th hearing be the hearing in which, pursuant to the motion of yesterday, the task force would discuss, provide edits, and vote to approve DOJ to move forward with final drafting of a draft report for the task force to then consider. Again, according to the current meeting schedule, I know you may be revisiting that, but according to the current meeting schedule, we would require some time then in the mid-February hearing for the task force to discuss and provide edits on the first draft, so that the task force has an opportunity to talk as a group about what's in that draft and make sure that the draft reflects, again, the direction, impressions, conclusions of the task force. Then we would go back and staff would again, based on the direction of the task force, compile a final draft for the task force, of the task force's report for the task force, which would then be reviewed in the mid-March hearing, which is the last currently scheduled hearing before the June 1st date that the task force previously voted to publish the first report. So what you're looking at in this slide is our plan for presenting and making sure that the report is both efficiently getting done on a schedule, and is coming back to the task force for the task force's direction continuously.
Mr. Newman, I'm not sure if you're in the position to speak on this right now or any staff member. In terms of the actual written report, do you know where conversations around mental health and physical health may fall in the actual report? That may inform when we want to speak on it in the public hearing.
Sure. I'm happy to speak on it. In the outlines that we've provided to you, there is one outline that is the health section of the report, and that outline includes some key points relating to mental health and other health issues. So I believe that you have that at this point. And we would, of course, welcome any kind of information or additions or, supplementation of that. Obviously, the ultimate draft of the report would need to reflect what we hear in the hearings and what all the task force members want to say in that component of the report. But the base outline with some of the base information you have, and we welcome any edits or suggestions or additions. I also wanted to mention, I said before, the June 1st deadline is by vote of the task force. That's the statutory date for the report. I need to correct myself so that I'm not saying anything incorrect. That's the statutory date for the report, and so we'll need to comply with that statutory mandate. So the mid-March hearing is the last hearing that we have scheduled for the task force to be able to vote to approve the final draft before, according to the current schedule, before the June 1st statutory deadline.
Mr. Newman, I have a question about what is your projection in terms of how much time would be needed, how much time would we need to allocate to for each of these dates you've outlined? I'm just trying to figure out how much time we have for witnesses, since I feel like that is probably the biggest value add for this report, getting witness statements. I'm trying to just figure out what is the schedule going to look like, and how much time we will need to allocate away from witnesses to do this.
Sure, and I completely understand that question. I was looking at the schedule. I mean, if you're contemplating changing around the schedule for the witness panels and focusing more on mental health or health in general at the meeting, I think the answer to that question is really the task forces. Far be it for me to say that you can only have a certain amount of time to discuss and provide edits and vote on the outlines. Ideally, we welcome, like I said, all of your edits and recommendations and suggestions in the outline, so that when you get the final outline circulated to you in advance of the December meeting, it will reflect already your thoughts and additions and things like that. Again, these are the outlines. So for the outline component, we should be able to at least incorporate the things that people want to be saying in the final report, incorporating the additions, and if there are concerns, redressing those concerns. We can do that, one-on-one as people provide feedback on the outlines as you're going through it. That doesn't need to necessarily wait for a full discussion in the meeting. The other two meetings, I think that's, there's a question about, the amount of time. That'll really depend on the discussion that ends up being had.
Chair Moore, may I, along those same lines, ask a clarifying question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so in batch 2 of the outlines, item number 10 is where health and public health come in, but it's currently listed as healthcare infrastructure and public health, which again is fairly narrow and doesn't quite capture the mental health or general medicine practices in medicine. So I think the earlier question about when does this show up, and that could determine when we need to make sure we include adequate time to mental health and health, is that if it's going to go into that interim report due in June, then we need to perhaps have a new meeting added to make sure that that topic is adequately covered, maybe a one-day session. And I would suggest if we end up doing something like that, that we consider adding an extra session after the holidays, because otherwise, if we do this, we have to do it right before Thanksgiving to give people adequate time, expert witnesses to have adequate time to prepare. Because trying to fit, into 10 to 15 minutes, some of the information I anticipate will be coming out will be a true challenge. People will have the information, but how to put it into a 10 to 15 minute soundbite will be the real challenge. So I guess what I'm asking is, one, I think we need to revise the way it's currently listed in the outline to be something more inclusive than healthcare infrastructure and public health. And then secondly, that if we want to make sure that we include that as part of information and findings for that interim report, then we consider adding an extra meeting that could be one day to address those topics. We can't hear more.
Was that a question directed to me? I can't.
No, it was just an open comment to anyone to respond to. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the sooner the action we take, the better. That was actually something I was going to suggest, member girls, is that we consider action items around changing up the schedule for the December hearing, because we would have this November to contemplate this individually, how we want to reconceptualize the process. We have a whole month to do that. Then we come back in December with our our action items that we could make motions on about how we want to change the future of the hearings. But like I said, I think the sooner the better. So if you want to kind of, and I don't want to prematurely put this out there, but if you're ready to make a motion around adding another hearing related to those topics, we can do that. But I also wanted to kind of recenter back to December 8th and 9th to get a consensus from the task force about how it's currently structured, and if the December hearing in particular needs to change, and if so, what needs to be changed.
I would be hesitant to offer a motion at this point, not having heard from some of the other task force members to see what their thoughts are on this.
Yes. And I'll be quiet for a minute. I just wanted to just provide some more feedback. So for instance, on the topics of gentrification and homelessness, thinking about bringing people in, like there's someone named Damian Goodman, who's a part of 40 Acres in a Mall. He was leading the efforts to try to buy the Crenshaw Mall. He's been leading efforts around anti-gentrification efforts for a while now in the Southern California area. There's Shirley Raines, who is a homelessness advocate. Pete White is also someone who's a homelessness advocate. In terms of public health, maybe bringing in those two doctors that broke that groundbreaking report where they're arguing that reparations is a public health priority. And I think to Member Grill's point, right, not necessarily inviting high-profile speakers to the art, media, and entertainment section or panel, but bringing in some folks who are like on the ground day to day, trying to create change in Hollywood and other areas, and even academics, right? There's Dr. Darnell Hunt, who's I think the director of the Voice Center. He was, he has a report that gets published every year about the diversity of Hollywood and how Hollywood could be changed to ensure there's increased diversity. So just putting those names out there and ideas for how the December hearing can be structured and conceptualized. Does any other task force member have any feedback, questions, comments, or concerns with the tentative agenda as it's laid out?
Chair Moore, I just have a few.
Oh, Member Monica Montgomery Step, you are recognized.
Thank you. The format is kind of hard for me to see, so it's probably hard for you to see too. So yeah, I do agree that we have to or need to broaden the definition of how we're going to talk about health. It kind of is reminding me of what Isabel Wilkerson said about really using the determinants as health determinants as a measure when we begin to quantify the harm too. So I think it's important that we break that off into maybe another day, which would leave a section of what is currently before us for December 7 and 8. It would leave a section blank. And so thinking about just breaking up, as you stated, Chair, breaking up the entertainment, arts, I think sports, there's a lot there too. So we would probably need to do the infrastructure, gentrification, homelessness. Let me pull it up on my own in one day, and then do the entertainment, sports, arts, and culture another day. So that's what, when I'm thinking about all of the comments, that is what I think I would maybe like some feedback on. Just want to put out there too that we had discussed, and I think there was a consensus on bringing the Secretary of State back. And so I think maybe that's later in the conversation, maybe that's sooner. I don't know how much we want to, we agree that the the conversation around the community of eligibility is, an evolving one. And so just thinking about that as well. That would be my feedback. Just one more, Dr. Rodney Hood in the area of public health, and then Dr. Isaac Martin in the area of gentrification. But those are two that I'm thinking of that I can submit to the DOJ. Thank you.
Member Montgomery Stepp, that was helpful. Thank you. Vice Chair Brown?
Madam Chair, members of the task force, I am of the position that we definitely need to give quality time to the issue of public health and breaking it down into mental and physical health and the resources that we have not had to be a healthy community.
It sounds like it's shaping up, well, from the task force members who have spoken so far, that public health should potentially be dropped from this December hearing and added to a more larger conversation about health. Does that sound right, Member Gross? Because I know you also said you don't want, there needs to be quality time to mental health, particularly, and physical health as well.
Right.
So what are your thoughts about public health being added into that conversation?
Yeah. I think it fits in that conversation, and that if we pulled it out of the December meeting and then had a day that could unpack mental health, public health, because there are things to be addressed in all of them, and for different age groups. Black children, the suicide rates, higher than any others in the country. Yeah, there's so much there. So, yeah.
Okay, that's Member Javon Scott Lewis, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chair Moore. So I wanted to just kind of also emphasize the fact that some of the topics that we are going to begin addressing, there's a time shift to them where they are more immediate experiences. So what we've been doing thus far has been really addressing historical issues, right? And so what we're doing by thinking about questions, around health, education, housing, these are much more immediate and pressing matters for the community. And so we actually do need to make sure that we provide considerable time. So again, this is in support to, I think, what is being proposed. I have a comment regarding the sports and entertainment emphasis. I'd like for us to also consider, moving away partly an emphasis in that area on exclusion, right? Again, there's a component that's important to that, but it's not necessarily representative as we can think of injury related to health, housing, education, etc. However, it is an important area to discuss because of the contributions that African Americans have made to those industries, right? And the lack of recognition that they have received for those contributions. So in other words, there's a shift in what qualifies as injury, as far as I'm concerned, when we begin to think about sports and entertainment, right? So we're thinking about right? You get what I'm saying, right? So the amount of, capital that is generated by the sports industry, right, on the backs of, say, Black athletes, and the disproportionate lack of capital that is returned to the communities that they come from, right? The contributions that, the cultural contributions that Black culture, art, etc., has effectively provided, setting the foundation for what we understand as popular American culture, yet that is gone, right, unrecognized. In the words of Mos Def, Elvis Presley has no soul, Chuck Berry is rock and roll, right? And so I just want us to kind of think about, when we're thinking about injury in these different areas, I want us to also pay attention, right, to how we're qualifying and locating what qualifies as injury. And so I think, focusing on exclusion from entertainment it's important, but there's actually a bigger set of questions around that industry that looks like the unrecognized contributions and the actual capital related to those contributions of the Black community. Thank you.
Member Javon Scott Lewis. I don't have the name offhand, but in preparing for this, I did find an academic who wrote about NCAA and the millions of dollars that Black student athletes, don't necessarily get to see, and kind of having like a scathing critique of that industry and that system. It's super important conversation.
And we can think about what's happening on TikTok, right? Where Black creators are constantly, right, having their intellectual cultural property stolen and are not getting credited for it. And so, I mean, we can extend this even into thinking about, well, what do digital platforms, what is a reliance on Black productivity, right? So when we think about Black TikTok, for example, or Black Twitter, right, as engines for these apps, actual productivity.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you for that. So extending the conversation about media, maybe even to the digital media, being more intentional about that as well. Okay. Any other task force members have a comment or question as to the tentative agenda as it's presented right now? Then we can kind of shift the conversation to more action, where we, put into action some of the things that need to be changed to the agenda, what needs to be added in terms of substantive topics, but also action items. Member Tamaki, you're recognized.
Things. So as of yesterday's meeting, Lisa Holder, Chair Holder, Member Holder, and I are supposed to report back on subpoenas. So our intention is to confer and talk about what that means and what industries might be focused on and the practical aspect of how long it would take and whether we can shape a subpoena that's narrow enough to actually fit within our deadline that the legislature has imposed to actually be even helpful to the task force. I think all of those are open questions. So we're going to meet, but there needs to be time on the agenda to do that presentation on the question of subpoenas. And then with respect to healthcare, totally agree 100% with Member Grills and Member Holder and the other comments. I'm just looking at the first page of on December 7th. That first. Oh, I do want to say that the one absolute that we have to do is approve those outlines, because if we don't approve the outlines, it seems to me that it puts the June 1 report in jeopardy. So I just want to emphasize, I think this is what people already know, but there needs to be sufficient time on the agenda to actually approve 12 outlines. And that's probably a lot to bite off. We've already got 6, and we'll have another 6 by mid-November, and then edits due, and then approval process. So is that going to take 30 minutes? Is it going to take an hour, 2 hours? It really is, and it's one of the pillars of what this task force has to do. It's something that's going to live on way beyond the task force. It's going to resonate in California and across the country. So I think we got to be very mindful about that approval process, and then do it timely, read it timely, so that the DOJ can do its thing. And then turning to the first page on December 7th, I was just wondering about some things. There's a section on discrimination and technology, and I'm wondering if you could just shine a light on that for me. I can understand the topics of highways, freeways. I would think that redevelopment that Member Brown has talked about so much in decimating Black communities would be part of that. And then I could see the connection to gentrification and homelessness. I'm just wondering, on the topic of discrimination and technology, how that thinks. we've had some testimony about the discrimination in Silicon Valley, particularly Black engineers, and it was startling statistic about some 60% of the the software programmers in DC are Black, and what the number is 5% or less than that in Silicon Valley. Whether that is what this refers to, or is it referring to something else? It was just unclear to me on the outline.
We already have a lot on the table to discuss. I'm almost reluctant to add anything else. But while we're having this open discussion, when we do talk about media and entertainment, I would like to also, again, to look at it from a historical perspective and talk about media and entertainment as one of the major generators of bias and racial stereotypes, and get information from someone who studies the intersection between history and entertainment to talk about African American stereotypes that are generated through the media, that have historically been generated through the media, social media since Reconstruction, and how that has, and that would be a good sort of cue in or setup for the conversations we're going to have later about psychological harm. So I think that this might be a place to talk about that, get a historian in here to talk about.
Yes, Member Grill.
Thank you. I extend what Member Holder has just shared at the risk of adding more. It's really more of an expansion. When we talk about media and entertainment, we would be remiss if we left out print and television news. When we talk about major drivers of bias, the stories that they select, well, let me not go into the details. We should probably make sure that we include media in terms of the news as well.
Okay, so in the interest of time, maybe it would be good to, in terms of action items, take action on some things that must be a part of this next hearing in December 8th and 9th, particularly around subpoena power, the outline review, and then also I would say the discussion about enabling the live chat. And so if there needs to be a motion to, officially or formally agendize those items on the December agenda, as chair, I'm entertaining a motion on that for right now.
I can take I'm sorry. Go ahead, Assembly Member Johnson.
No, all I was going to say, does that address what everyone wants? I will second it, as long as we have incorporated everyone's wishes for the next meeting.
Oh, that's a good point. That's a good point. Let me take a step back. Other than the outline review, subpoena power, and discussion on the live chat, and are there any other things aside from fixing the scope of the subject matter? We'll get to that. But other than the outline review, subpoena power, and live chat discussion, are there any other items that are must-haves for this next hearing?
Just a point of clarification. I thought, were we going to have the live chat discussion today or next hearing?
Well, that's a good point. now I'm just going to seek clarity from the DOJ about that. So is this, in terms of voting for the live chat or discussion about the live chat, can we discuss that at this moment right now, or does that need to be formally and put on the agenda and discussed for the next hearing? There's been some confusion about that.
So I don't know, Chair Moore, I don't know if the parliamentarian would weigh in. I think our interpretation probably would be, because I don't believe this is an action item, but let me just look at how it was noted.
Correct.
It's not an action item for this component, so I think it would have to be discussed at the next meeting and voted on at the next meeting.
That is correct. That is correct. That is correct.
So parliamentarian, can I ask a question? So is the only thing that we can move right now as far as parliamentary procedures and rules and what we can and can't do, is it that we need to go ahead and adopt the outline and the draft schedule that was on the screen?
Okay, you're looking at the agenda. Yes, sir. You want to adopt the agenda, proposed agenda, and you might want to do it with flexibility so that if you're looking at the agenda in the timeline, and given what happened yesterday, I would also recommend that you add an agenda. Well, consider, I'm not going to suggest that you do it. I want you to think about adding an item on the second day that says unfinished business, so that in the event that you don't finish something the first day, that you can consider it the second day. But recognize, be careful doing that, because that may elongate your agenda. So if you do that, just keep that in mind when you're spacing out, what you're considering on the first day as well, as well as the second day, so that that you have enough time. And you have at the bottom of your agenda on both days the phrase that the times may change. So you're okay in terms of changing your time, but you definitely want to put that additional item, unfinished business, so that you can do what you wanted to do yesterday. You can put it over to the next day if you don't have enough time on the first day.
So I don't know where, I want to make sure we do this right.
Okay.
Was there a motion on the floor?
There has not been a motion made or seconded yet.
And Chair Moore, sorry, Assembly Member and Chair Moore, may I speak to two questions that I think are pending?
In the meantime, can staff place the agenda for the December hearing on the screen? Thank you.
Sure, and I think I can speak to the Assembly Member's question, which is because of the placement that we are in the agenda right now, we're not asking for we can't ask for a full vote on that full agenda. So we were responding yesterday. The task force voted on the structure for the report review, revisement, and approval process. So all we're saying in this segment of the meeting is that in order to get that done by the June 1st statutory timeframe, we would need time on the next meeting in order to have the outlines discussed and approved by the full task force, so that we can then turn to working to prepare a draft components of the report that reflect the task force's instructions as to what the report should contain. So the only pertinent point on this, Assembly Member, is that we would need to have time agendized in the next meeting for this component. And then I believe there was a question about infrastructure witness on expert testimony on discrimination in technology. That witness was on the Excel witness spreadsheet, and the witness is sort of the idea for that witness within this context of this technology discussion was to talk about discrimination in technology, how technology is utilized to discriminate, algorithms, artificial intelligence, and those issues. That's not necessarily something that needs to be resolved in this. I just wanted to make sure that I was responsive to the question about that particular witness. And again, if members of the task force have other witnesses on those topics, or you're voting on the agenda right now, so you may switch it all up. But I just wanted to make sure that was clear as to why they were placed there.
Okay. So I'm back again. So if we move to adopt the outline and the draft schedule that I guess is on the screen right now, that would help DOJ be able to stay on the timeline with their work?
That is correct. In order to comply with the vote that you all took yesterday, to schedule how the draft would be compiled for the task force's approval. Because we only have three more meetings currently scheduled. Gotcha. You may be changing that. But according to the existing schedule, we would need time on the December meeting to vote on the outlines, time on the February meeting to vote on but to have a discussion about the first draft that you all already voted to sort of have this done, and then time in the mid-March meeting, which is the last meeting currently scheduled before the June 1st statutory deadline, to vote on the final draft.
And before I move to adopt the outline and draft schedule on this, would this impede anything else that's been discussed for the last, half hour, 45 minutes, that we can also try to make sure we get all of those discussions, all those pertinent information that everyone brought up, which is very significant, that we're able to get that done too? Or is that two separate issues?
Is that a question for me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I believe, I don't think they're two separate issues. I think that that's one thing that I think that would need to be resolved. And I think the thing that I heard earlier was the idea of shifting entertainment, sports, arts, and culture to either another meeting, or shifting health into its own meeting, to create room on the agenda, not just in order to fully evaluate the outlines, and also to vote and discuss these other issues. So I think that's what the discussion was. And of course, that's the decision of the task forces.
And
Assembly member, before you craft a motion, this little piece of information may help. I'm just sort of calculating a schedule timeline-wise, because I think we should have a sense of what these items are how much time they're gonna take up. If let's say if the outline review takes 2 hours, because if we're talking about all 12 sections, it's probably going to be a significant conversation we have to have. That's probably going to be about 2 hours. If we have to discuss the live chat, that could be another half hour. Subpoenas could be a half hour. Unfinished business could be a half hour. Based on that, that's 3.5 hours. That's just sort of my timestamps. But just so that's, I'm thinking it's going to take about 3.5 hours just to discuss that business of the task force. And then I don't know how many witnesses are scheduled, so.
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, that's our decision. We can do it in an hour, or we can do it in 5 hours. So that's really kind of up to us. It's not up to DOJ.
Yeah, either way, I think we need to have a timestamp on these so we have a sense of how much time it's going to take.
And we need to stick to it, even though it may be difficult. So can we put a time, because that's your concern, how much time? And then there's the devil in the details, but how much time should we commit to this so that we can get all of this done?
Well, something else that we may have to add, it depends, maybe I can get some feedback from task force members, a discussion about designating a press liaison. I don't know if any particular task force member would want to volunteer for that. But if we need to have a discussion around that, just to ensure that we're not missing any.
Madam Chair, I thought we decided that everything would run through you and the vice chair. Because for example, I just got a press call right now. That's why I keep going back and forth. I'm referring them to you. So I thought that was something we kind of agreed to already. I don't think we were talking about hiring another person to do press or designating one of us as chair and vice chair. You should be speaking for the body, unless you want somebody else to do it.
No, I mean, that is something that I said, but understanding the different stakeholders in this process and people who are sticklers for process. So in the event that we need to have that conversation to formalize that, I was just putting that out there. That's all. But yes, since yesterday, the DOJ has sent me press inquiries, so we may not have to discuss that.
Okay. So I'm going to try this again. I think we can get it all done. I'm going to move to adopt the outline and draft schedule that is on the screen.
Second.
Seconded to adopt the draft outlines and the agenda on the screen. Is there any discussion on this matter?
Sorry,
I have a question.
Chair Moore. I
Go
do respond.
Whoa.
Apologies to Member Jones Sawyer. I'm just wondering how this is going to be possible without extracting something from the agenda as it exists. In other words, if we add a couple hours or more to, to do the outlines, and it may even take more than the 2 hours, and then we add on the subpoenas and the other issues about chat and everything. I think one of these sessions just has to go, and either is treated in sort of a summary form, maybe relying upon not live witnesses, but the materials that we've been given to read, and then substitute in that process, or it's moved to an additional session. So, for example, and again, at the risk of offending someone who's very interested and wants to hear the testimony. For example, the morning session on infrastructure, might that instead be devoted to the outlines, for example? I just think we need to rejigger a few things in order to realistically have the time to do what we need to do. That's all.
Madam Chair. Madam Chair.
Vice Chair Brown, you are recognized. Excuse me.
Yes, I have an emergency. I must leave there.
Vice Chair Brown, you have an emergency and you must leave. I hope all is well. You were cut off. I don't know if you wanted to continue to speak. But in the event that you are still here, I just wanted to say thank you, and we hope all is well.
You have a quorum. You still have a quorum, Madam Chair.
He was asking if we still have a quorum.
Yes. Yes, we do. Thank you. Yeah, and to Tamaki's question, like member Reggie Jones Sawyer, so it seems like from the conversation that we've had for the past 30 minutes or so, it seems as if people want health to be taken out of the agenda. And so if that is the case, then that kind of goes against the motion that's on the floor to adopt the agenda as it is presented.
Do you really think the discussion in the live chat is that long? I mean, as chair and vice chair, hopefully you guys can put it together where we can come up with a plan to move that and move everything.
Sorry. I think the point was for moving health is to make sure that we're providing adequate time to discuss issues surrounding health, not only public health, but mental health and physical health as well. So that, I think, based on the conversation that we were having, is the rationale for taking health out and not necessarily like, you know, infrastructure more broadly or gentrification or homelessness.
So you're taking health out and we're going to discuss it another time? Or is this added to the whole overall? This is where I'm confused. Is this another meeting we need to add? Because I see meetings in December, February, and March. So what is the issue that there's an urgency that we need to discuss it in December?
No, not necessarily. Maybe Member Holder or Member Grills or Member Tamaki can speak to it, but I think based on what I was hearing, there would potentially be an additional meeting, an additional hearing, whereby we discuss health on its own. And even what I'm hearing from Tamaki, issues around technology as well is something that I'm hearing too. But the main point is that, you know, well, I'll let others speak.
Well, if I could just chime in, Chair Moore. So we're looking to carve out additional time. So in as much as the health discussion needs a full day, that's what people are saying, then yes, I think we're talking about adding a day. And I think Chair Grills was talking about after the holidays to insert a full day of testimony and discussion, just focus on health. So if we do that, that removes, you know, one of the morning sessions on December 8th. So that frees up time to insert the discussion and approval of the outlines anyway. As to how long the chat discussion would take, maybe it might not take that long. But I think the outlines will probably take long or that long, significantly longer, and we've got 12 to get through. And the report, it depends on the outlines, and our input depends on the approval of the outlines for the report. So I think we need to carve out significant space for that anyway. And then the technology discussion it didn't sync well with gentrification and homelessness, which seems to be the focus of December 7th. There's highways and things like that, park construction that contributes to the homelessness. Gentrification is definitely part of that. So that seemed to be symmetrical and thematically makes sense to me. And if we remove the discrimination in technology and either take it up another day or dispense with it, then we free up additional time. That's all. That's all I'm saying.
So,
Madam Chair, may I intercede for a moment? There is a motion on the floor with a second. I was trying to determine, is that part of discussion as to whether or not you're going to vote that motion up or down? Or are you wanting to vote it down and then go back to amending the proposed schedule? It sounds like the latter. Can you clarify that?
I can withdraw, but let me try this. What if I withdraw the motion? We did another motion, because it sounds like that infamous S word is important, having a Saturday meeting or having an additional meeting. Because we're adding to the schedule of 12 outlines where we're getting to 13 and 14 or whatever that number is, and we may need another hearing. That's what I'm hearing.
Okay, so if you withdraw your motion and the person who seconded withdraws their second, then you have nothing on the floor, and then you can proceed accordingly. So you wanted to, if you withdraw your second.
Before I did that, I want to make sure that we're not
what they want.
Okay. Yeah. Does that sound reasonable, especially in light that we really wanted to have a Saturday hearing, meeting, outreach anyway? Maybe this is where we could actually have one.
Yes, agreed.
Yes, same.
And any other, the other thing is the other beauty of it, if there's any other additional sections or things we want to discuss, we could agendize that in that also, so that we don't leave anything out that we felt was not adequately in the 12 outline sessions. And we'd also satisfy having a hearing on Saturday so people can actually come, killing two birds with one stone. I see some heads going like that, so I'm gonna give this another shot. So I would like to adopt the outline and the draft schedule that on screen with an additional hearing, whether that's on Saturday or another day that's convenient with the members of this task force to hear any additional sections outside the 12 outline sections that could be incorporated into that, so we can completely exhaust this subject. How about that? Probably the longest motion in the history of motions, but yeah.
Can I make a friendly amendment to it?
Anything you want at this point.
Okay. Okay, so could the motion be something to the effect of moving to modify the December agenda, removing public health from the agenda, and adding in adequate time for the discussion of outline. And there was an outlines, and there was
Subpoenas, subpoena and chat function.
Live chat, yes. And then we could do a different motion to then add another meeting for coverage of, perhaps we could do one additional day in mid-January. And that could be a different motion to address mental health, physical health, public health. And perhaps maybe we could add the technology and infrastructure on that day.
So you want to have?
What, can you please clarify? You have one motion. Okay, what the Assembly Member Jones Sawyer, he withdrew his motion. The seconder did not withdraw theirs.
Oh,
I'll withdraw my second. I will.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Now, so now you have made a motion. Would you make your motion clean? It's not an amendment to anything. It's just a new motion. And deal with your 2-day hearing first, because that, if you're moving to amend or to adopt the proposed agenda. So identify what is on that proposed agenda, item by item, so that it is clear to whoever's writing this down what your agenda will look like on that 7th and on the 8th, and then move to adopt that proposed agenda. And your second motion is to add a third or another meeting date for Saturday, from what I'm hearing. Is that correct?
I was trying to do it all in one motion.
Okay, you can do that, but I just want to make sure it's all clear.
Well, Parliamentarian Johnson, I think, Member Reggie Jones Sawyer was moving us forward. So I want to thank Member Reggie Jones Sawyer for that. But I think Member Grills kind of encapsulated what the motion is. And so
No,
also
she encapsulated what she wanted. She wanted to discuss the outline, I believe, and some other things.
No, that wasn't me. That was something everybody has already said we need to do, is discuss the outlines that we're going to make our June. That wasn't a personal preference.
Oh, okay.
I was just trying to streamline what you were saying to make it really crystal clear. That's all. So if it did not do that, I am sorry.
Yeah, I think mine wasn't that clear either. So I just wanted to adopt the outline and the draft schedule that's on the screen. That's all I wanted to do. If I'd have to do a separate motion, if we have to do a separate motion to have a Saturday meeting to ensure that we take up all the other items that have been discussed for the last 45 minutes. If that's appropriate, and that gives everyone comfort level that we discussed everything, then let's do it.
Chair Moore and Assembly Member, I can try to take a stab at one motion.
Yes, thank you.
That's okay.
Before you do that, yes, but also I wanted to say, the consensus seems to be, before we put out a motion on the floor, the consensus seems to be we're going to take health out and focus on health at another hearing after the holidays. Focus on technology even after the holidays, whether that be on a weekday or Saturday. And for the December hearing, we're going to talk about infrastructure, gentrification, and homelessness, preferably on day one, and then have a full day two, where we talk about entertainment, digital media, the contributions of the African American community, not only looking at it in the perspective of exclusion. So I kind of wanted to give a high level overview of the discussion so far. Also bringing in that in the December meeting, we need to have a conversation about the outline, subpoena power, and the live chat.
Yes.
You don't have consensus because I don't understand what you just said. So
well, I
don't understand what a discussion about the outline. What is it? Another discussion about the outline?
Well, I think that's the missing piece here. I think there needs some clarity. Well, let me just clarify, Reggie John Sawyer. So yesterday, we voted that the draft outlines that the DOJ staff has been sending us, we're going to use that as kind of a basis where we're going to individually provide feedback on those particular outlines. And then at a public hearing, we're going to discuss all of our comments related to those outlines and then approve the outlines based on our comments. So, you know, it's not a conversation about, that's what the conversation is going to be about. We have these 12 outlines. The DOJ is sending us these 12 outlines. We're going to provide comments when we're at home or when we're at work through chat changes. And then when we meet again in December, the task force is going to consolidate all those comments from us. We're going to have a discussion about it, and then we're going to vote on approving the outlines as amended or revised.
Exactly.
Is that?
Exactly.
Yes.
That is correct. And that's one agenda item with 12 components, possibly, however you end up doing it.
It may take 2 hours. It may take, like you said, it could take 30 minutes. It could take an hour, but realistically, given the breadth of the material, we're probably going to have to take at least an hour and a half for it.
Well, the thing is, Madam Chair, is if it takes less than that, that's good. You know, so you're good. You can keep moving.
True. That's true too. If there isn't any consensus, that's fine. If there's any other clarifying questions that the DOJ can clarify, that I can clarify, that Parliamentarian Johnson can clarify, or any other task force members can clarify for one another, let's do that before we entertain a motion.
Chair Moore?
You're recognized.
I think you're saying if I can clarify a question. I think there was a question raised in the discussion that I think that I can clarify maybe to help. This is with regard to it sounds like a proposal to pull public health from the December meeting and schedule a separate meeting on public health. Now, we talked yesterday in the DOJ updates about coming back in the next meeting with a sort of a study and a response on the request for Saturday meetings, and then a vote in the next meeting about scheduling Saturday meetings. And one component of the scheduling of the Saturday meetings, of course, is all of your schedules. So what I would say is, one important factor in whether we can schedule in January, especially, which has a couple of holiday days in January, we would need to make sure that we can get a quorum on a Saturday. So I don't know if the idea of breaking out public health and scheduling another meeting, and then we can sort of take in the information from the members of the task force as to availability, and then come back in the next meeting and have dates that we can report out to you. I think we have to report some of the other scheduled dates as well. We could do that as well. We could make that part of our DOJ updates, and then the action item could be setting the meeting for a separate distinctive meeting on public health, whether it's 1 day, 2 day, Saturday, etc. That's something that could be scheduled at the next meeting, and we can report out on all of that information.
That's fine, but just to clarify, it'll be a meeting on health in general, not necessarily public health. Public health would be discussed.
Sorry, thank you very much. I was going off of the agenda here.
No problem. Okay. Any other questions? If not, we can entertain a motion at this time.
Honestly, I think the only thing that we have consensus on is that we adopt what's up on the screen. And in the December meeting, we also talk about the live chat subpoenas and unfinished business.
Yeah. If I can just go back, I'm going to take a stab at a motion. Just one thing before I do that is I do think that we should include in the motion a totally separate meeting for the discussion of health. And because we are running up against the clock clearly based on what is in front of us, and I prefer not to wait until the next meeting to just decide when we're going to meet again, because that may be too late. So I'm going to take a stab at this. So I move that we adopt the December 7 and 8 agenda with the following modifications: that we remove the public health section, that we add a discussion on the following things: all 12 outline sections, subpoena, and the chat function, and that we have a standalone meeting to discuss health.
Second.
Second.
It has been properly moved and seconded to adopt the December 7th and 8th a tentative agenda with the following modifications: remove public health as a substantive topic, add discussion and items for all 12 outlines, subpoena powers, the chat function, and to also have a standalone meeting for the issue of health in general. Is there any discussion on this matter?
That include removal of the discrimination and technology section.
Happy to accept a friendly amendment to remove.
Yeah, thank you. I think that would help with the time element.
Yes.
Thanks.
Any other discussion on the matter? Okay. Parliamentarian Johnson, does there need to be, I believe so, from my notes, there needs to be a formal process for amending the motion?
To amend the motion?
Mm-hmm.
What are you asking? I'm sorry. Is there a formal process? Yes.
Right. And so does
Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you, does someone want to